September 27, 1942, about 9:30 South Atlantic, off the coast of Modern. Stephen Hopkins does not slow down. She turns her stern toward the enemy to present the smallest possible target and to unmask her only real tooth, a solitary, antiquated 4-inch gun mounted on the aft deck. What follows is one of the most ferocious and improbable surface actions of the entire war. It is a knife fight in a phone booth. The Steer unleashes a broadside of 5.9-inch shells that tear through the thin steel plating of the Liberty ship. The Hopkins shudders under the impact. Steam lines rupture, the deck becomes a slaughterhouse. But the American gun crew, led by Lieutenant Kenneth Willett of the U.S. Navy Armed Guard, returns fire. They are civilians and a handful of Navy reservists fighting a dedicated warship. The range is point-blank, so close that the Hopkins crew can use their machine guns to sweep the decks of the German raider. Shells from the Steer hammer the Hopkins repeatedly. The engine room is hit, killing the crew below instantly. The bridge is raked with fire. Captain Buck is wounded, then killed. Lieutenant Willett, gutshot and bleeding, keeps the 4-inch gun firing until the magazine explodes. Amidst the smoke and the screaming of twisted metal, Cadet Midshipman Edwin Joseph O'Hara, a young merchant mariner from the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, sees the gun crew fall. He runs to the 4-inch gun. Alone, surrounded by the dead, O'Hara loads and fires the last 5 shells remaining in the ready locker. He scores hits. The Steer is burning. The German raider, built to terrorize the shipping lanes, has been gutted by a cargo ship. The Stephen Hopkins is sinking. She is a flaming wreck, listing heavily. But she has done the impossible. As the surviving crew members abandon ship, they watch the Steer wallow in the waves. The damage inflicted by the Hopkins is fatal. Captain Gerlach orders his ship scuttled. The Stephen Hopkins becomes the only U.S. merchant ship in World War II to sink a German surface warship, but the ocean is unforgiving. The Hopkins slips beneath the waves, taking Captain Buck, Cadet O'Hara, and dozens of others with her. The 15 survivors huddle in a single lifeboat. They have no radio. They are thousands of miles from help. They will drift for 31 days, covering 2,200 miles before reaching the coast of Brazil. This was the reality of the United States Merchant Marine. They were not soldiers. They were not Marines. They were civilians, volunteers who signed on to move the fuel, the food, and the ammunition that kept the Allied war machine alive. They wore no uniforms, saluted no officers, and, initially, carried no weapons. Yet they found themselves on the front lines of a global war that did not distinguish between a battleship and a tramp steamer. The statistics of their sacrifice are staggering, though often forgotten in the shadow of the armed forces. The casualty rate for the U.S. Merchant Marine was the highest of any service during the war. Approximately 1 in 26 mariners who served were killed in action. By the time the guns fell silent, 9,521 of them would be dead. 733 American merchant ships would be lying on the ocean floor, amounting to 3.1 million tons of twisted steel and lost cargo. The war for the Merchant Marine did not begin with a declaration from Congress. It began in the cold, dark waters of the Pacific, hours before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the SS Cynthia Olsen, an Army-chartered freighter carrying lumber to Hawaii, was churning through the mid-Pacific. 800, the Japanese submarine I-26 surfaced and opened fire with its deck gun. The Cynthia Olsen had no guns, no escort, and no chance. She was shelled and sunk, her crew taking to the lifeboats, never to be seen again. They were the first American casualties of a war their country had not yet officially entered. As 1942 dawned, the focus of the slaughter shifted to the Atlantic. The German U-boat arm under Admiral Karl Dönitz launched Operation Drumbeat. They sent their gray wolves across the ocean to hunt along the eastern seaboard of the United States. They found a shooting gallery. The American coastal defenses were woefully unprepared. Cities like Miami, Atlantic City, and New York refused to enforce blackouts, fearing it would hurt the tourist trade. The result was a massacre known to the German U-boat crews as the Second Happy Time. Merchant ships sailing at night were silhouetted perfectly against the glowing backdrops of the coastal cities. U-boat commanders didn't even have to use their sonar. They simply sat on the surface, watched the dark shapes of tankers and freighters pass in front of the neon lights, and fired their torpedoes. In March 1942 alone, 27 Allied ships were sent to the bottom in these waters. Mariners spoke of seeing the headlights of cars on the shore as their ships burned and sank a few miles out. The water was thick with oil and blood. It was a time when a mariner could sign onto a ship in New York, be torpedoed off New Jersey, rescued, and be back in the hiring hall looking for another berth within the week. And they did go back. They had to. The mathematics of World War II were brutal and simple. It was a war of tonnage. To keep a single soldier fighting in Europe or the Pacific for 1 year required between 7 and 15 tons of supplies. Food, fuel, ammunition, medical kits, spare parts, everything had to move by sea. Without the merchant fleet, the tanks would run dry in North Africa, the bombers would be grounded in England, and the Marines would starve on Guadalcanal. The Axis powers understood this equation perfectly. Their strategy was not just to defeat Allied armies in the field, but to sever the arteries that fed them. To counter the hemorrhaging of ships in 1942, the worst year of the war for Allied shipping, with over 1,200 vessels sent to the bottom, the United States launched the greatest industrial shipbuilding effort in history. The solution was the Liberty ship. Based on an old British design, it was simple, slow, and ugly. President Roosevelt famously called it a dreadful-looking object, and Time magazine dubbed it the ugly duckling. But it could be mass-produced. The first of these, the SS Patrick Henry, had slid down the ways in Baltimore back in September 1941. By the height of the war, American shipyards were turning them out with impossible speed. The SS Robert E. Peary was assembled in a record-breaking 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. These ships were not built for longevity. They were built for immediate utility. They were welded rather than riveted, a process that was faster but led to structural fractures in frigid waters. They had a top speed of only 11 knots, making them slower than a surfaced U-boat. Yet 2,710 of them were built. They became the workhorses of the war, crewed by men who knew that their vessel was essentially a floating warehouse with a thin steel skin, packed with explosives and high-octane fuel. Nowhere was the danger of this service more apparent, or the conditions more hellish, than on the Murmansk run. This was the convoy route from Iceland to the northern ports of Russia, Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. It was a voyage through a frozen gauntlet. In the winter, the superstructure of the ships would coat with tons of ice, the weight of which could capsize a vessel if the crew didn't hack it away with axes and steam hoses in gale-force winds. In the summer, the sun never set. The 24-hour daylight meant there was no darkness to hide in. The convoys were exposed around the clock to German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers operating from occupied Norway. It was here in the Barents Sea that the merchant marine endured one of its darkest chapters. On June 27, 1942, convoy PQ-17 departed Iceland. It consisted of 35 merchant ships, heavily laden with tanks, aircraft, and trucks for the Soviet Red Army. Among them was the American Liberty ship SS Christopher Newport. For the first week, the convoy pushed north and east, shadowed by German reconnaissance planes. The tension on the bridge of the Newport was suffocating. The crew knew they were being watched. On July 4, Independence Day, the hammer fell. A Heinkel He-111 torpedo bomber slipped through the anti-aircraft screen and put a torpedo into the Christopher Newport. The explosion tore the ship open. She didn't sink immediately, but she was dead in the water. Her crew was taken off by a rescue ship, and the drifting hulk was later finished off by a U-boat. But the loss of the Newport was only the beginning. British intelligence had received reports that the German battleship Tirpitz and other heavy surface units were steaming to intercept the convoy. Fearing the destruction of his escort warships, the First Sea Lord in London, Admiral Dudley Pound, made a fateful decision. He ordered the escorting cruisers and destroyers to withdraw at high speed to the west. Then he issued the order that every merchant mariner dreaded: convoy is to scatter. The protective ring vanished. The merchant ships were told to proceed to Russian ports independently. They were slow, armed only with light defensive guns, and they were now alone in the Arctic Ocean, hunted by a wolf pack of U-boats and squadrons of bombers. It was a slaughter. Over the next few days, the German forces picked them off one by one. Of the 35 merchant ships that started the voyage, only 11 made it to Russia. 24 ships were sunk. 153 mariners were killed in the freezing waters, where survival time was measured in minutes. The loss of material was staggering. Enough tanks to equip an entire armored division and enough aircraft to equip 4 fighter wings now lay at the bottom of the Barents Sea. For the mariners who survived, the bitterness toward the naval command that had abandoned them would last for decades. While the Arctic was a specialized nightmare, the North Atlantic remained the central battlefield. By March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its crisis point. The Germans had refined their Wolfpack tactics, coordinating groups of U-boats via radio to swarm convoys. In a single month, during the battles for convoys HX-229 and SC-122, a massive force of 45 U-boats overwhelmed the escorts, sinking 22 ships. The brutality of these engagements is illustrated by the fate of the SS William C. Gorgas. Sailing in convoy HX-228, the Gorgas was carrying 900 tons of TNT and heavy steel plating. On a pitch-black night in March, a torpedo slammed into her starboard side. The explosion missed the TNT but decimated the engine room, killing the engineers instantly. The ship began to settle. The surviving crew abandoned ship and were miraculously picked up by the British destroyer HMS Harvester, but the war was not done with them. The Harvester herself had been damaged after ramming a U-boat earlier in the battle. She was limping, unable to keep up with the convoy. Later that same night, the U-boat U-432 found the lagging destroyer. 2 torpedoes broke the Harvester in half. The survivors of the William C. Gorgas, having just escaped their own sinking ship, were cast back into the freezing Atlantic. Most did not survive the second sinking. It was a cruel reality of the merchant service. Being rescued did not guarantee safety. It often just moved you to another target. The freezing waters of the North Atlantic were not the only enemy, nor was the torpedo the only hazard. As the war ground on, the sheer scale of the logistical challenge became a weight that threatened to break the Allied back. The sinking of ships like the William C. Gorgas and the Christopher Newport were not merely tactical losses. They were strategic hemorrhages. Every ship on the bottom meant 10,000 tons of supplies that would not reach the front. To put a single American infantryman in the field in Europe or the Pacific and keep him fighting for 1 year required the delivery of 7 to 15 tons of supplies. A tank division required exponentially more. The mathematics of liberation were staggering, and the burden of that math fell squarely on the shoulders of the merchant marine. By 1944, the tide of the U-boat war had begun to turn, thanks to long-range air cover and cracked codes, but the danger for the merchant crews simply changed shape. It shifted from the lonely terror of the open ocean to the chaotic violence of the invasion beaches. When the Allies launched the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the merchant marine was not waiting in the rear. They were in the vanguard. Over 200 United States merchant ships participated directly in the D-Day landings. They sailed into the teeth of the German Atlantic Wall, maneuvering cumbersome, slow-moving freighters through minefields and pre-sighted artillery zones. While the world remembers the Higgins boats and the brave infantry storming Omaha and Utah beaches, few recall the Liberty ships and tankers that anchored just offshore, sitting ducks for shore batteries and the Luftwaffe, offloading the fuel and ammunition that made the breakout possible. The commitment of the merchant marine to the invasion went beyond transport. It extended to the ships themselves. In a grim calculation of utility, Allied planners realized they needed breakwaters to protect the artificial Mulberry harbors being constructed off the French coast. The solution was the Gooseberry Line. 33 merchant ships, many of them battered veterans of the Atlantic convoys, were selected to be intentionally sunk. On the days following the initial landings, these ships were sailed into position by their civilian crews while under fire. The captains gave the order to set the explosive charges in the bilges. As the charges blew, the crews abandoned ship, watching their vessels settle onto the shallow seabed to form a steel reef against the English Channel's storms. Ships that had survived U-boat wolfpacks and Arctic gales were sacrificed to create calm water for the landing craft. The mariners who scuttled them simply transferred to other vessels and went back to work, shuttling back to England to load another cargo. This relentless cycle of load, sail, discharge, and return defined the mariners' war. But unlike the soldiers and sailors they supported, the men of the merchant marine lived in a strange administrative purgatory. They were combatants in every practical sense, dying at a rate that eclipsed the uniformed services, yet they were legally civilians. This distinction led to one of the most bitter injustices of the war, a reality that stung almost as much as the salt spray. The regulations were cold and precise. A merchant mariner was paid wages by the shipping company that owned or chartered the vessel. If a ship was torpedoed and sunk, the company's obligation to the crew ended the moment the ship was lost. The clock stopped when the water closed over the bow. Consider the survivors of the SS Stephen Hopkins or the SS William C. Gorgas. As they scrambled into lifeboats, covered in oil, watching their shipmates drown or burn, they were technically unemployed. Their pay ceased immediately. For the 31 days the Hopkins survivors drifted across the South Atlantic, starving and dehydrated, they were not earning a dime. When mariners were pulled from the water by rescue ships, often with nothing but the oil-soaked clothes on their backs, their wages had already been cut off. There was no combat pay, no hazardous duty bonus that extended past the life of the ship, and for those who were captured, the situation was even more dire. 609 American merchant mariners were taken prisoner during the war, mostly by the Japanese in the Pacific or from raiders in the Indian Ocean. They were held in the same brutal camps as Army and Marine POWs, subjected to the same starvation, torture, and forced labor. Yet, because they were civilians, their families back home often stopped receiving their allotments. The paychecks stopped coming. Wives and children of captured mariners faced destitution, while their husbands and fathers rotted in camps like Cabanatuan or worked the Burma Railway. Despite this, the volunteers kept coming. The pre-war force of 55,000 experienced seamen was decimated early on, but by the end of the conflict, the ranks had swelled to over 215,000. They came from every walk of life: Midwestern farm boys who had never seen the ocean, inner-city laborers, and old salts who had sailed since the days of coal-fired tramp steamers. They were an integrated force in a segregated era, with black and white mariners often serving on the same ships, sleeping in the same quarters, and dying in the same waters, long before the U.S. Navy fully integrated its ranks. They bore witness to the global scale of the conflict in a way few others did. A mariner might survive the freezing run to Murmansk only to find himself months later sweating in the tropical heat of the Persian Gulf, delivering Lend-Lease trucks to the Soviets via the back door of Iran. They sailed the suicide runs to Malta in the Mediterranean and hauled high-octane aviation fuel to the island hoppers in the Pacific. The cost of this ubiquity was catastrophic. The final tally of the war revealed a grim statistic that was kept quiet during the hostilities to maintain morale. The death rate for the U.S. merchant marine was approximately 1 in 26. No other branch of the armed forces, not the Marine Corps storming the beaches of Iwo Jima, not the paratroopers dropping into Normandy, suffered a higher proportional casualty rate. By victory in Europe Day on May 8, 1945, and the subsequent Japanese surrender, 9,521 merchant mariners had been killed. This figure is likely conservative, as record-keeping for civilian crews was often fragmented, and many who died of wounds after being discharged were never added to the official rolls. 733 U.S. merchant ships, totaling over 3.1 million tons of capacity, were obliterated. That number represents more than just steel and cargo. It represents a fleet of ghost ships that paved the ocean floor from the Arctic Circle to the South Pacific. To understand the magnitude of this sacrifice, one must look back to the very first hours of the conflict, before the United States officially knew it was at war. The war for the merchant marine did not begin with a declaration from Congress. It began in the silence of the Mid-Pacific on December 7, 1941. At 800 hours, simultaneous with the first bombs falling on Pearl Harbor, the Army-chartered freighter SS Cynthia Olsen was steaming toward Honolulu with a load of lumber. She was a civilian ship, unarmed and alone. The Japanese submarine I-26 surfaced and began shelling her. There was no return fire, only the frantic tapping of the radio operator sending a distress signal that would be drowned out by the chaos erupting in Hawaii. The Cynthia Olsen slipped beneath the waves, taking her crew of 33 and 2 Army passengers with her. They were the first American casualties of a war that had technically not yet begun for them, disappearing into the vast indifference of the Pacific. If the Pacific was a vast, lonely graveyard, the Atlantic coast of the United States was a shooting gallery. By January 1942, the German High Command launched Operation Drumbeat, dispatching long-range U-boats directly to the American seaboard. The U-boat commanders arrived to find a target-rich environment that defied belief. The coastal cities, Miami, Atlantic City, Virginia Beach, had not yet enforced blackouts. The neon glow of hotels, boardwalks, and streetlights cast a brilliant illumination miles out to sea. Merchant ships hugging the coast were perfectly silhouetted against this backdrop, moving like black cutouts on a lit stage. The German crews called it the second happy time. They didn't even need to use their sonar. They could simply sit on the surface at night, watching the parade of tankers and freighters and pick their targets. In March 1942 alone, 27 Allied ships were torpedoed and sunk in U.S. waters. Tourists on the beaches of Florida could sometimes see the flames on the horizon or watch as oil-soaked debris washed ashore the next morning. The U.S. Navy, stretched thin and initially resistant to the convoy system along the coast, struggled to stem the tide. For the merchant crews, it was a terrifying lottery. They were sailing defenseless in their own home waters, often within sight of the land they were supplying, yet utterly exposed to the predators lurking in the dark water. But the narrative of the merchant marine is not solely one of victimization. These were civilian vessels, yes, but they were manned by men who refused to be mere targets. As the war progressed, the Liberty ships were fitted with defensive armament, usually a single gun mounted on the stern and a few anti-aircraft guns, manned by the U.S. Navy Armed Guard. These small detachments of Navy gunners lived alongside the merchant crews, forming a symbiotic relationship born of necessity. The merchant mariners passed the ammunition, the Navy boys fired it. And on rare occasions, the hunted became the hunter. The most extraordinary example of this defiance occurred on September 27, 1942, in the South Atlantic. The Liberty ship SS Stephen Hopkins was sailing alone, en route from Cape Town to Dutch Guiana. She was in ballast, riding high in the water, her holds empty after delivering supplies to the Middle East. The morning broke gray and misty, with squalls reducing visibility. On the bridge, Captain Paul Buck, a seasoned mariner, kept a sharp watch. About 9:30, two shapes emerged from a rain squall just 2 miles away. They were not Allied ships. One was the Steer, a heavily armed German commerce raider disguised as a merchant vessel, and the other was her supply ship, the Tannenfels. The Steer was a wolf in sheep's clothing, packing 6 5.9-inch naval guns, torpedo tubes, and 2 seaplanes. She was built to destroy merchant shipping. The Stephen Hopkins, by contrast, had a single, antiquated 4-inch gun on her stern, a weapon meant for discouraging surface submarines, not fighting surface warships, and 2 smaller 37 guns at the bow. The German commander, Captain Horst Gerlach, ordered his ship to drop its disguise and open fire. He expected the American freighter to surrender immediately. It was standard procedure, a warning shot, a stopped engine, and a boarding party. But Captain Buck had no intention of stopping. He turned the Hopkins stern to, presenting the smallest possible target, and ordered his radio operator to send an SOS. Then he did the unthinkable. He ordered his crew to engage. What followed was one of the most ferocious single-ship actions of the war. The Steer unleashed a broadside that tore into the Stephen Hopkins, shredding the superstructure and killing several men instantly. But on the stern of the sinking Liberty ship, the U.S. Navy Armed Guard, commanded by Lieutenant J.G. Kenneth Willett, roared back. The 4-inch gun began to bark, sending shells slamming into the German raider. The range was point-blank. It was a knife fight in a phone booth. The Hopkins was being hammered by superior firepower. Shells ripped through the engine room, severing steam lines and plunging the ship into darkness. The boiler exploded, killing the black gang below decks, including Second Engineer George S. Cronk, who stayed at his post to the end. Topside, the deck was a slaughterhouse of twisted metal and burning paint. Lieutenant Willett, wounded by shrapnel, kept his gun crew firing, putting shell after shell into the Steer's waterline and steering gear. As the Hopkins began to list heavily, the Navy crew was cut down one by one. When the gunner fell, Cadet Midshipman Edwin Joseph O'Hara, a student from the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point who was aboard for training, saw the gun crew decimated. The young cadet, who had never fired a shot in anger, did not hesitate. He scrambled over the bodies of the fallen naval detachment, physically hauling the heavy 4-inch shells into the breach. Alone on the burning fantail, with the ship disintegrating beneath his feet, O'Hara fired the remaining 5 rounds into the Steer. His aim was true. The shells tore into the German raider, starting uncontrollable fires and rupturing the hull. Minutes later, the Stephen Hopkins plunged stern-first into the South Atlantic, taking O'Hara, Captain Paul Buck, and the second engineer down with her. But they had done the impossible. Across the water, Captain Horst Gerlach of the Steer looked at his blazing command. The damage inflicted by the lone Liberty ship was fatal. The German captain gave the order to scuttle. For the first and only time in the war, a civilian merchant vessel had fought a heavily armed German surface warship to a standstill and sunk her. The silence that followed the roar of the guns was deafening. The survivors of the Hopkins, numbering only 15 men out of a crew of 57, found themselves clinging to a single lifeboat in the vast emptiness of the ocean. They had no radio, limited rations, and were thousands of miles from help. For 31 days they drifted. The sun blistered their skin, and their tongues swelled from thirst. They navigated by the stars, fueled only by a desperate will to live, drifting 2,200 miles until they washed ashore on the coast of Brazil. They were skeletons wrapped in oil-stained rags, living testaments to ferocity that few back home understood. While the men of the Hopkins were fighting their lonely duel in the tropics, a different kind of horror was unfolding on the other side of the world, in waters so cold that a man overboard would freeze to death in minutes. This was the Murmansk Run, the convoy route from Iceland to the northern ports of the Soviet Union. If the Atlantic Run was a gamble, the Arctic Run was a suicide pact. The destination was Arkhangelsk or Murmansk, vital lifelines where Allied tanks, aircraft, and fuel were offloaded to support the Red Army's fight against the Wehrmacht. But to get there, the merchant ships had to run a gauntlet that favored the hunter in every conceivable way. In the summer, the sun never set. The midnight sun meant 24 hours of daylight, leaving the slow-moving columns of freighters permanently exposed to German reconnaissance aircraft based in occupied Norway. There was no cloak of darkness to hide under. In the winter, the darkness was perpetual, and the storms were biblical. Ice accumulated on the rigging so thickly that crews had to go out on deck with sledgehammers to beat it off, lest the weight capsize the ship. And always, beneath the gray swells, the U-boats waited. The defining tragedy of this route, and perhaps the darkest chapter in the history of the merchant marine, began on June 27, 1942. Convoy PQ-17 departed Hvalfjord, Iceland, bound for Russia. It consisted of 35 merchant vessels, heavily laden with $700 million worth of war material, 297 aircraft, 594 tanks, and over 4,000 trucks. It was a massive injection of steel intended to stiffen the Soviet front. For the first week, The convoy moved with the disciplined precision of a herd, protected by a heavy escort of destroyers, corvettes, and anti-aircraft ships. But the Germans knew they were coming. The Luftwaffe shadowed them relentlessly, circling just out of gun range like vultures. U-boats began to probe the perimeter. Tensions were high, but the defensive ring held. Then came the 4th of July. It was not a day of independence, but of abandonment. The British Admiralty, operating on intelligence that suggested the mighty German battleship Tirpitz and her battle group were steaming to intercept the convoy, made a catastrophic calculation. They believed the close escort could not protect the merchant ships from a surface fleet engagement. At roughly 2200 hours, a signal was flashed from London to the convoy commander. Convoy is to scatter. The order was a death sentence. Scatter meant that the defensive formation was to be broken. The destroyers and cruisers turned and sped away to the west, intending to intercept the German surface fleet, a fleet that, as it turned out, had not yet even sortied in force. The 35 merchant ships were left alone. They were stripped of their sheepdogs and told to make their way to Russian ports individually, at their best speed. The captains of the merchant vessels watched in disbelief as their protection vanished over the horizon. They were now solitary targets in a sea teeming with predators. The German pilots and U-boat commanders could hardly believe their luck. The herd had been broken. The slaughter began almost immediately. Among the first to fall was the Liberty ship SS Christopher Newport. She had already been damaged by an aerial torpedo that struck amidships, killing the engine room crew and deadening the ship in the water. She became a sitting duck. A U-boat finished her off, sending thousands of tons of supplies to the bottom of the Barents Sea. But she was just the beginning. For the next week, the Barents Sea became a hunting ground. Luftwaffe bombers, Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s, swooped down on the lone freighters, dropping torpedoes and bombs with impunity. U-boats surfaced to use their deck guns, saving their precious torpedoes for the more elusive targets. It was a massacre in slow motion. One by one, the ships of PQ-17 were hunted down. The SS Pancraft, carrying crated aircraft, was bombed and set ablaze, drifting for hours before sinking. The SS Washington was torpedoed, her crew taking to the boats in the freezing chop, watching their ship rear up and slide under. There was no rescue coming from the Royal Navy. They were gone. The survivors were left to the mercy of the Arctic and the enemy. Of the 35 merchant ships that had set sail from Iceland, only 11 reached their destination. 24 ships were sunk. The human cost was staggering. 153 merchant mariners were killed, many freezing to death in open boats after their ships went down. The material loss was even more grievous for the war effort. The Germans sank 210 aircraft, 430 tanks, and 3,350 vehicles. In 1 week, the merchant marine lost enough equipment to outfit an entire army. The survivors who did make it to Murmansk or Arkhangelsk found little respite. The ports were within range of German bombers, and the mariners spent their time in Russia dodging air raids, living on meager rations, and waiting for the long, dark winter voyage back home. They had delivered the goods, but the cost had been absolute. The disaster of PQ-17 stands as the single greatest loss of any Allied convoy, a grim testament to the vulnerability of the merchant fleet. The catastrophe forced a suspension of the Arctic run, leaving the Soviet Union to hold the line without fresh supplies for months. It was a brutal reminder that in this war, the most dangerous job was often found not in the trenches, but on the open sea. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.